All right, today we're going to jump into a really powerful column by Shankar Ayar. He's dissecting this global crisis. You've probably heard of it, Operation Epic Fury. And wow, he has a pretty stunning critique of how we all got here. So, let's just get right into it.
You know, the column kicks off with this quote from Game of Thrones, of all places, and it just perfectly frames the whole theme of this analysis, which is this: how can the decisions of just one leader cast such a huge, destructive shadow across the entire globe?
So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll look at the War-a-Lago crisis itself. Then we're going to try to figure out the why behind it all. We'll touch on the hubris of history, some new rules of power, how this actually hits your wallet, and finally, we'll ask a really big question. Has the whole idea of victory become obsolete?
Okay, so the column paints a pretty tense picture. We're 2 weeks into Operation Epic Fury. Think about it. More than a dozen countries have already been dragged into this conflict, thousands of flights are grounded, and basically the entire world is just holding its breath, glued to the news coming out of the Persian Gulf.
And the economic shockwave? Man, it was immediate and it was brutal. Crude oil just rocketed past $92 a barrel, and gold surged beyond $5,300 an ounce. The author uses this great phrase, saying the markets were tumbling down a rabbit hole of anxiety. And that really nails it, doesn't it? This wasn't just some regional conflict. This was a full-blown global economic crisis in the making.
The language being used here is absolutely critical. The U.S. government is very deliberately calling this military operations, avoiding the word war. The column draws a direct line from this to Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. It's like a modern playbook. Use sanitized language to try and downplay a devastating reality.
And that brings us to the name the author gives this whole thing, War-a-Lago. Yeah, it's a clear shot at where the operation was launched from, but the column argues it symbolizes something much, much deeper. This is a foreign policy driven by personal politics and politicized faith, not by careful, sober statecraft.
This leads us right to the central mystery of the whole conflict, the search for a coherent why. I mean, why this war and why right now? Well, according to the column, the official story has been a constantly moving target.
Get this, in just 1 week, the administration gave 3 totally different justifications. First, they said Iran was planning an attack during diplomatic talks. Okay, then the story changed. Secretary Marco Rubio admitted Israel was planning a preemptive strike, and the U.S. was basically just providing cover. Then, by the end of the week, the reason changed again. Now it was all about Iran's nuclear program.
And this is where the whole official story just completely falls apart. The column points out this massive contradiction. I mean, if President Trump claimed way back in 2025 that Iran's nuclear sites were already obliterated, then how can they possibly be the urgent reason for war today? This kind of chaotic messaging really suggests a deep, deep lack of strategic logic.
The author makes the point that this chaotic plunge into war, well, it's not new. History is just littered with examples of superpowers, kind of drunk on their own power, diving headfirst into total disasters.
And you see this pattern throughout history, right? The author points to Napoleon getting totally trapped in what he called his Spanish ulcer, or the 1953 US-led coup in Iran, which planted seeds of resentment that are still growing today. And of course, he brings up recent US interventions, noting that in Afghanistan, America ultimately replaced the Taliban with the Taliban.
But this isn't just some abstract history lesson. The column points to the horrific, immediate human cost of this kind of hubris. In this conflict, the U.S. is being accused of causing civilian deaths, highlighted by what the author calls a tragedy of epic proportions, the deaths of over 160 schoolchildren in just one incident.
So this whole theme of historical hubris leads us directly to the administration's approach to international law. The author argues that what we're witnessing is just a blatant disregard for the established rules of how countries are supposed to interact. The prime example of this? The sinking of the Iris Dina. Now, this wasn't some warship on a combat mission. It was an Iranian frigate on its way home from a diplomatic naval review in India, and it was torpedoed by a submarine way outside the official war zone. The column presents this as just a staggering display of superpower arrogance.
The author's crucial point here is that the U.S. has basically swapped the power of example for what he calls the suzerainty of power. It's an old imperial idea where it's not about leading allies through respect, but about a dominant state just controlling the foreign policy of weaker ones.
And you can literally hear this shift in the way top officials talk. The author calls it an embedded hierarchy of language.
You have U.S. officials publicly permitting or allowing a sovereign nation like India to manage its own energy policy. It's the language of an emperor speaking to a subject, not the language of one ally speaking to another.
So, why does any of this stuff really matter to you? Well, the column connects all this geopolitical chaos directly to your everyday life, and specifically to your wallet.
And the line is pretty direct. Millions of gallons of jet fuel being burned for airstrikes make oil prices spike, and you feel that every time you go to the pump. And at the same time, the blockade of the Hormuz Strait isn't just stopping oil. It's choking the supply chains for the everyday stuff we all depend on.
And here is the perfect punchline for the author's whole economic argument. Inflation, sadly, cannot be knocked down by missiles. It's such a powerful summary of the limits of military power. You just can't bomb the cost of living back down to normal.
So all of this brings us to the author's final and, I think, most powerful argument. He takes all these points, the shifting reasons for the war, the historical hubris, the economic pain, and uses them to ask a really fundamental question about the very nature of modern war.
The way the author analyzes victory here is just fascinating. For a superpower like the US, anything less than a clear, decisive win looks like a failure. But for what he calls an asymmetric power, like Iran, they don't have to win in the traditional way. Just surviving, just getting what the author calls a draw, is a victory in itself. This profound uncertainty has created what the column calls an age of oracles. Because the official stories have collapsed, people are so desperate for answers that they're turning to mystical sources. You've got news channels in India featuring astrologers, citizens in Israel are apparently consulting the Kabbalah. It just shows a complete and total breakdown of trust in traditional expertise. And so, we're left with the author's final, really provocative question. In a world disinterconnected, where a supply chain blockade hurts the aggressor almost as much as the target, has the very concept of winning a war become obsolete? That's a critical thought to grapple with as this whole crisis continues.